Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. A marriage made in hell. Barely 5 feet tall, sweet and innocent looking, Charlene Gallego used all of her charms to beguile pretty teenage girls and young women into the back of a van where her lethal husband, Gerald, lay waiting. A killer couple bound together by secrets, lies, and sex slave fantasies. Married multiple times and still in his early 30s, Gerald Gallego found the perfect companion in Charlene. Over a grisly period of 26 months, their bloody and brutal rampage of kidnapping, rape, and murder spanned 3 states and claimed 11 lives. The book this evening that we're featured is Sex Slave Murders by R.Barri Flowers. Welcome to the program, and thank you to agreeing to this interview, Barri Flowers.
Thank you, Dan. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you very much. And for those people who saw the description of the program, it is my huge mistake. It is the Sex Slave Murders. So just to get that straight for everyone that's following this. Now, first off, this was one of my favorite questions because it nets me all kinds of answers. Very interesting. You have an extensive background as a criminologist and a best-selling author. This book is originally came out in 1996, if I'm not incorrect.
Yes, that's correct.
And tell me how you came, as a person with your background, how you came to this story and why you decided to write about this particular story.
Okay, that's a good question. Well, I first heard about the Gallegos in 1980, that was at the tail end of their killing spree, but I happened to have just gotten out of college at that time and had just gotten married and moved to Sacramento from the Midwest. And it was around that time that the Gallegos were abducting and murdering their 10th and 11th victims in the city, Sacramento. So the fact that these last 2 victims, college sweethearts, Mary Beth Sowers and Craig Miller, were around the same age as me and my own wife, it hit home to me just, how life could be snuffed out just like that if you happen to be in the wrong situation. So from that point on, this story just stuck with me over the years, and it was a story that I felt I had to tell to let other people know about this type of thing and the unusual nature of this husband and wife serial killer tandem.
Right. Now, the subtitle of this is The Horrifying True Story of America's First Husband and Wife Serial Killers. That's interesting because there's been a few other cases. We spoke to one off air, Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo, and there's been other people, 2 male companions have been couples in crime like this, but you say this is the first husband and wife serial killer duo in America.
Yes, absolutely. As far as being serial killers under the definition of serial killers, 3 or more murders committed by the 2, that makes them the first ones to actually fall under that banner.
Right.
There have been other twosomes, as you mentioned, but not like these 2, where they were married and bound together and doing their thing as male and a female in matrimony and murder.
Right. Well, let's go back very much in your book. You've covered the victims' lives. You've done the investigative work to find out about Gerald Gallego's upbringing, his background. Tell us about Gerald Gallego and his parents. Talk about his family life and the general environment in which Gerald Gallego grew up. It's incredible.
Okay. Well, Gerald came from a very troubled, dysfunctional background, to say the least. His father, Gerald Albert Gallego, murdered 2 lawmen in Mississippi in the 1950s and was sentenced to death for his crimes. In fact, he became the first person executed in Mississippi's Parchment Penitentiary's new gas chamber. So that was quite a legacy for his son to have to deal with. Gerald actually had never met his father, but he knew of him, and he certainly knew of his crimes. His mother was a prostitute when he was growing up, and he had a number of other family members who were involved in various types of crimes, sexual and property crimes, and so he had, you could say the deck was stacked against him in that regard. He was also a victim of child abuse, physical child abuse when he was young, so he was in and out of juvenile hall and adult prisons as well as he got older, committing everything from sex crimes to robbery to other violent crimes. So he was.
What kind of? Can you tell us a little bit about the? Can you tell us a little bit about the sex crimes and what did the violence manifest itself? Tell us a little bit about that, but I think it's important.
Okay. Well, he before he was even in his became an adult, he was involved in sex offenses as a juvenile, molestation, and he this metamorphosized into incest of his own child once he became a young adult, Gerald, and so the seeds were planted for his later sex offenses by his sexual misconduct as a child and his molesting his own daughter.
Now, Gerald is, despite these problems, a dysfunctional life, a very sordid life, and surely he wasn't the most happy-go-lucky guy, but despite that, you paint a picture of Gerald being quite an outgoing and charming person, at least and a good-looking guy. So basically, he did okay in terms of romance, we'll say.
That is true. He was married actually 5 times before he ever laid eyes on Charlene. So he certainly had a charm about him which was able to entice females into being with him consensually. But the dark side of Gerald's personality wanted more than that. So he still liked the idea of sexual relations by force, and he was able to use that same charm that he used to marry his previous wives. He was able to capture Charlene's fancy to marry and set the stage for the things that were to come for the two of them together.
Now, let's go back just a little bit with these other wives. Some of these marriages are very, very brief, and some are not as brief, but still certainly brief, because you're talking about 5 marriages before he's 31 years of age.
Yes.
So they're not long-lasting marriages. Now, as far as you knew, as you could find out, I mean, there seems to be obviously escalation, and that's no surprise, but what would each one of those women say? Was progressively his behavior changing from one marriage to the other, or out of those 5 women, was there some shared characteristic that they noted in general about his behavior, especially in the sexual deviance category?
I think there was some shared behavioral traits he exhibited with all of them, and that started with physical abuse. From things that I've heard and actually talked to one of them, they have been victims of domestic violence, with Gerald being the perpetrator, and that was tied into some of his sexual perversity. I think that he liked the idea of forcing himself even then upon some of his wives, or not all of them, often induced by substance abuse. So even though he was able to charm these women initially, I think that one reason his marriages didn't last very long was that the true side of his nature came out with each wife, and they wanted nothing to do with him.
So was he a controlling person, or was he just prone to violence once he was intoxicated? And you talked about substance abuse. We're talking about primarily alcohol and cocaine for the most part?
Alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, and some other drugs as well, I believe, that he was dabbling in, and especially once he became involved with Charlene. But I think that he was definitely a controlling freak. In fact, I could say that. He was definitely a control freak, and he was domineering and used fear to control his wives as well as his daughter. And
now, which one of the wives? When did it occur that he graduated to incest with his own daughter? And which of the marriages is this? And at what point prior to meeting Charlene did this all occur? Give us a time frame.
I believe this was his third wife that he had the child with, and he began molesting her when she was 5 or 6 years old, right up into her teens. So this crossed over into the time in which he knew or met Charlene, that he was still abusing his daughter.
And what did his third wife have to say? Was she oblivious to all this abuse at the hands of her daughter?
Oh, well, she learned about the abuse as well as his own mother, Gerald, and the authorities were notified. I mean, she didn't know initially, I don't believe, but in the earlier years, but when she found out, he was reported, and that's when Gerald went on the run. That was to sort of set the stage for his ultimately changing his identity. He became known as Stephen Fell during his time with Charlene, and it was primarily to try to dodge the law regarding incest charges that were filed against him.
Mm-hmm. Now, when does he meet Charlene, and what year is this, and under what circumstances do they meet?
They met in 1977. I'm sorry, when they met at a club. Charlene, who came from a well-to-do family, had a high IQ, attractive young woman, but she still longed for more adventure. She wanted to get away from suburbia and that type of life, and just wanted to find some action, something that stimulated her intelligence, perhaps. And so when she met Gerald at this bar, the two of them hit it off right away. He saw in her an attractive lady. She saw in him someone who was tough, the type of guy that bad boy image,
right,
that captured her fancy.
He was a big guy, wasn't he?
Yes.
Like, she's about 5 foot tall, so he's a bigger guy, taller guy.
Yes. Yeah, she was barely over 5 feet, so she was captivated by him physically, and his character, which was charming, but at the same time tough and perhaps more masculine than some of the people she had been with previously. That appealed to her, his being a take charge type guy.
Now, what for people that are trying to imagine what the Gerald looks like, because we've got to see that this guy's a charming guy. He's a bunch of women want to marry this guy. He has no problem with women whatsoever. He he's like you say, he's a charming guy. Maybe describe Gerald for our audience, so we get sort of an idea where Charlene is in terms of with Gerald. Maybe even describe both of them physically, so that we have sort of a picture of what goes on. I think will be important to later in the story.
Okay. Well, he was around 6 feet, maybe a little over, sort of a husky build, dark hair. I guess you could say he was sort of brutish looking, even though he had his appeal for women, but he really had a more hardened, brute type look about him that still was able to, along with his character, captivate women. In Charlene's case, she was petite, blonde, blue-eyed, attractive, the girl next door type female that any man, would have found appealing, and that was certainly the case with Gerald once he laid eyes on her.
She had been married a couple times as well herself.
Once.
Okay.
Previous to Gerald.
Right. Yeah, and like you say, she comes from, her dad was a grocery chain executive, and
yes, actually she had been married twice. I'm sorry about that. Yes, she had been married twice before meeting Gerald. One marriage lasted barely a month, I believe, but yes, she was married twice.
Now, what I'm trying to establish, too, is that there must have been some kind of, like what you're saying, is she's come from suburbia, she's raised around money. He comes from a totally dysfunctional family, but he does have, and I think this is important, I'll explain later, he does have a sort of a menacing look. And she has a very innocent look, really.
Yes.
So I think it's that combination is very interesting and makes for part of the story later. When they do meet, and what is one of the sexual characteristics that Gerald introduces? What is one of the things he talks about? I mean, he isn't full-blown escalated here, but what does he talk about initially to Charlene, and ask her to do, or what's the fantasy he discusses with Charlene immediately?
Oh, well, initially he talks about her being the girl with the heart, as he referred to her, and this was, in his mind, someone who was his number one girl and who would do whatever he wanted her to do. And so she quickly became so enthralled with him that he was able to lay his cards out on the table, so to speak, in what he was looking for. And as far as sexual, he basically wanted her to be willing to do every and anything, any type of experimentation he had in mind, and frequent sexual relations. And so she was happy to oblige, because they also started using drugs early on in their relationship, and alcohol, and so she was willing to hold up her end of what he wanted at that time.
So we're talking about significant. We're talking significant drug use as well, especially cocaine. Yes. I mean, they're smoking marijuana, but I mean, they're both heavily into cocaine use. Where are they getting? Where's the money coming from for this? By the way, what are they doing? Are they dealing a little drugs to get some drugs, or?
Oh, well, Gerald worked odd jobs every now and then to get some of his money, but also Charlene was the only child. She was a daddy's girl, and so basically any money that she needed, she could always go to her mother and father to help her out, and they were happy to do so. Right.
And so at some point they have a conversation, and he asked her to lure underage girls. He talks about the underage girls in his fantasy. Tell us about that conversation, and if you know exactly how far into the relationship was it before they had this fateful conversation about his fantasies.
Okay, well, he began talking about Gerald's sexual fantasies less than a year into their relationship. he had fantasies in which they talked about it quite a bit, actually, before they began to put it into practice. But basically, he wanted to have sex slaves who would do his sexual bidding anytime he wanted, and if not do it willingly, which they wouldn't, then he would force them to as his sexual slaves.
Right.
And he wanted Charlene to be an active participant in it in any way that he wanted her to. In this instance, it was mainly to be the one that brought them to him. So in Charlene's case, I think that she was perhaps growing a bit weary of trying to satisfy his perverse sexual needs. And so initially I think that she went along with it thinking that, they would be able to take up the slack, if you will, for his sexual demands, and then she would be able to take it easy a bit. But I don't believe that she, at the beginning, realized just how far he planned to go once he had abducted these sex slaves. She may have thought that he'd let them go and, they could go on with their lives, but he wasn't about to do that because he was at least smart enough to know that if he could be identified, then he could be caught. If he's caught, he'd go back to prison. So
she didn't do a lot of thinking about this thing because otherwise she would have realized that that murder was part of this whole thing.
Well,
certainly
right.
They wouldn't be letting these people go.
Yes.
Now tell us about the actual event, the first September 11th, 1997, and the abduction of the two victims. Tell us about the entire event and Charlene's participation and her reaction. Tell us about the whole thing. Go into the details of it. It's such an incredible beginning to this terror rampage.
Okay. Well, that was on September 11th, as you said. It was 1978, actually.
Pardon me, 1978. Yes.
And they had their 1973 Dodge Recreation van driving around Gerald and Charlene. It was when Gerald told her, "I'm ready. I want a girl now." And if she thought, Charlene, that he may have been joking, he let her know that he wasn't, that he wanted someone, and he wanted someone now, and that she was going to help him to do so. So they ended up at a shopping center in Sacramento called the Country Club Plaza, and Charlene went inside and under Gerald's guidance and looked around till she could find someone that fit the bill of what he was looking for, young, attractive, like her and his daughter. And she found two young ladies, Rhonda Scheffler, Kippy Vaught, both 17. Charlene was able to get them out of the shopping center under the pretense of getting high.
Wow.
And unfortunately, the two young ladies just liking the idea of going out smoking some marijuana, and Charlene seemed innocent enough, so they never gave it a second thought. They were happy to participate. Once they got outside, led to the van, innocently enough, Gerald was waiting there with a .25 caliber pistol, and at that point he forced them into the van and took off to isolated area, farming area, and sexually assaulted both girls, bludgeoned them, then shot them to death.
What were they doing on the ride out there? What was their initial reaction, and what did he say to them to get their compliance completely?
Well, he told them that he was just going to have some fun with them. If they cooperated, he'd let them go, and they could be on their way. So the girls were certainly frightened, as anyone would be under those circumstances, but
sure.
The one thing that I would say was the common denominator with all the victims of the Gallegos was the fear of being killed. He had the guns at every point, and so these first two victims, along with the others, they were hopeful that if they just did what he asked, he would let them go, just as he told them he would.
Right.
And unfortunately, the further they got away from society and potential witnesses, the more their fate was sealed.
Now he, you say bludgeoned them, then he shot them. First he raped them. What was Charlene doing at this time? This is the first murder. You have said already that you think that she was trying to. You didn't think she thought that this would go as far as it did. But what was her reaction? What did she do? How did she protest? Did she protest? What did she say? Did she scream? What was her reaction?
Oh, well, her reaction was she just wanted to pretend as if it was not happening. He left her in the van after he found a secluded area that he felt he could finish the job. So she actually waited in the van while he shot these two teenagers to death, and just had the view that, if I just pretend it didn't happen, maybe I can live with that. I mean, I believe it crossed her mind that at that point there was no turning back for her, that if she were to do anything or try anything, that if he could do that to them, he could just as easily do it to her. So I think it was more of a sense of resignation on her part. Once it happened, she realized just what depths he was willing to go to fulfill his sexual fantasies while also staying out of jail. Now,
the thing is that there are, the prosecutor would disagree with some of that. We won't go jump ahead at all, but for those even that have read this book, including myself, it seems almost inconceivable that this woman would react the way you report in the book that she reacted. Despite the information you're giving me, it seems still the most horrifying is that she just knew what was going on, had to know what was going on, knew how responsible she was, and yet I can take you've written a book on this, but it still is, it's hard to fathom that this woman could do what she did, and it continued, so.
Well, Dan, the sad truth of the matter is that there are a lot of killers like her and Gerald who defy logic in how they act and react. And in her case, she was, if she had been the normal person, she would have run for the hills, the moment he began talking about these sexual fantasies and slaves and abducting girls, but she didn't. So she didn't react as one might do if, they use their common sense, normal behavior. So her behavior was abnormal, his behavior was abnormal, and that's what kept these two together through all these victims.
Sure.
She was, they had gotten high ahead of time, so that helped lower the inhibitions.
Mm-hmm.
And she was just in a state of denial, I'd say, as to everything that was happening.
Right.
And it's as hard as that may be to fathom, that's the case with a lot of these killers who are, or killers or partners of killers who are aware of what's going on. They still try to distance themselves from it, if only in their minds.
Right. Now, where does he dumps these? How does he dispose of these female victims? He doesn't bury them. He just dumps them in the woods.
Well, he dumps them in the desert, farming areas, or in the woods, anywhere. He did only one or two instances did he actually have buried them, but he wasn't very concerned about them once he got out into some area outside of civilization that he felt they'd probably not either be disposed of by animals out there, or no one would happen to come upon them. So he wasn't very concerned about making sure that they were buried, never found, for the most part.
Now, what happens next with Charlene and Gerald? How long is it till their next? Because we talked about this rampage being in a fairly close period of time, 26 months or so. So who are the next victims? Well, and what are those circumstances?
Their next time to push the sexual fantasies up to this murderous level was on Father's Day, June the 24th, 1979. Brenda Lynn Judd, 14, and Sandra K. Colley, 13, were abducted from the Washoe County Fair in Reno, Nevada. This time, with Charlene once again acting as the bait, she convinced them to come out to pass handbills around, put them on cars. So these two young teenagers, impressed that they would be singled out by the innocent-looking Charlene, went with her. And once again, Gerald was waiting in his van, and this time with the .44 caliber over and under Derringer. He had a host of weapons that he liked to use interchangeably. So they were sexually assaulted again and bludgeoned before being murdered with this .44 caliber.
Now, in terms of you notice with being a criminologist, the news stories, if the first two female victims actually were lured into the van to smoke marijuana, they're less regarded as victims because somehow or other they brought some of this misfortune upon themselves. Now, with Sandra Colley and Brenda Judd, these really were even more innocent girls, weren't they? They're trying to make a couple dollars handing out these handbills, right?
Well, in a manner of speaking, but for the first two, Rhonda Scheffler and Kippy Vault, yes, they were going out under the guise of getting high, but, that was a normal thing then and probably is now to a large extent.
Oh, yeah. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm just saying sometimes in the media's eye, that's all. I mean, in terms of media's eye, and that even the ruse is getting even more, trying to capture even more innocent victim.
Yes.
I mean, they're all innocent. There's no such thing as a guilty victim, but I'm saying it's just you just paint the picture of how sweet and innocent these victims really are. They are not hardened people at all, and being lured to their death.
Right. For Brenda Judd and Sandra Colley, at least one of them had a problem with running away at one point. So, which is, there's a far cry between that and going out and being abducted by some psychopath. But initially it was unknown. The authorities were suspect as to whether or not these two teenagers had just run off somewhere or were taken against their will. And it was just the fact that this happened in a different state from the first two abductions and murders. Authorities weren't able to tie the pieces together at that point, and that was a big part of the success the Gallegos had in staying on the lam for as long as they did, because they were doing this in three separate states, moving back and forth, and the authorities were investigating these separately, but not as something that was connected.
Right. Not at all, yeah. Okay, so after the Sandra Colley and Brenda Judd were killed and disposed of, again, probably pretty similarly, who are the next victims, and how long before the next murders?
Well, the next murders were 10 months later to the day, April the 24th, 1980. Karen Chipman Twiggs and Stacey Ann Redigan, both 17, were abducted from the Sunrise Mall in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento. And they, too, were lured once again to smoke marijuana. Seems like they were rotating their bait for these victims. And once again, Gerald was waiting. Charlene did her part to perfection. Gerald was waiting with the pistol. And as he had learned from his previous victims, the victims were compliant in the face of a gun. So this was, really, this was working for him. And so this motivated him to keep doing it whenever the urge struck him, because he hadn't had any resistance. I mean, once they saw the gun, they were totally obedient. And then, once he got them in the van, tied them up and everything, it was, no turning back, unfortunately for them. They were raped, bludgeoned to death with a hammer in Limerick County, which is near Lovelock, Nevada.
And where were their bodies dumped?
They were dumped in the desert.
Again, yeah. So still, after now 6 murders, still there's no, police have not made any connections.
None whatsoever.
They don't believe they have they don't know they have a serial killer or a serial killer couple on their hands at all.
Right.
Wow.
Yes, they are unfortunately clueless at this point, just isolated cases. And in none of the cases, had they really made much progress. They looked at a few people, but basically they didn't have anything solid on anyone, and so the cases were, pretty much just in the air there, while other things were happening in the crime world, and the Gallegos continue to move around and find new victims to go after.
Now, the next murder is different. And so maybe tell us what's going on in Gerald and Charlene's life, if there are any changes that are happening. I mean, we know that Gerald's on the run. Gerald is living his murderous fantasy with his dream wife, Charlene. But what's going on in the background? At some point, if I'm jumping ahead, pardon me, as Charlene gets pregnant. If I'm jumping ahead, go back to where his MO changes, where he's walking up to people himself. The ruse that has worked so well for so long, somehow he's abandoning it, or he's emboldened, or he's modifying his MO anyway. And so tell us about what turn of events creates this change for them.
Okay. Well, the Gallegos were rotating between being called Gerald and Charlene Gallego and Stephen Fell and Charlene Fell. They actually married under the second set of names, so that they were married twice. Right. Because Gerald was trying to escape this molestation charge with the fake identity. And so no one was the wiser about his murderous activities. And so that was one thing that kept them looking over their shoulders. But they also had stepped up on their substance abuse and were becoming, frankly, a little reckless at this point. They got more reckless as time went on. But this was really when they began to turn a corner in their pattern of behavior. Charlene was pregnant at this time when the next murder occurred. June the 7th, 1980, they were near Gold Beach, Oregon, and unlike the previous times, this time Gerald, he wasn't willing to just wait until his fantasy young women, teenagers type, came along. He instead just saw someone, which happened to be Linda Aguilar, 21 and pregnant. She was just walking down the street, and Gerald just told Charlene, "I want her." Charlene, it was obvious that Linda Aguilar was pregnant.
Wow.
Charlene was pregnant. She, could have some sort of relate to that.
Sure.
Some degree, but not enough to say, well, can't we, go after someone else, Gerald?
Right.
Instead, he said who he wanted, and she was, okay, let's, if that's what you want, that's what we'll do. So they offered Linda a ride, under the guise of a ride, and she, trusting Charlene, who was the bait once again, she agreed that they could, she could get where she was going quicker in their van.
One thing, pardon me, was it obvious to Linda Aguilar that Charlene was also pregnant?
Not at that time, I don't
Okay.
think. They actually came up to her while they were still in the van.
Okay.
This time, they just drove up to her, pulled the window down, and Charlene asked her, if you like a lift type thing.
Right.
So it wasn't until she actually was in the van that I'm sure she realized that she was pregnant too.
Right.
But Gerald actually assaulted her in the van, raped, bludgeoned, strangled, and then eventually buried in the on the beach. And autopsy revealed that she had still been alive while she was buried, but she suffocated from the sand.
Wow.
So that was that brought it to a whole new level. He now had two murders there together with one person and her unborn child.
Now, the next woman is Virginia Moko. 34. Isn't she 34 years of age and a mother of two?
Yes. Yes.
Tell us about this, because this is of course very, very important to the story. What happens with Virginia?
Yes. On July the 17th, 1980, Virginia Moko, a West Sacramento bartender, was befriending the Gallegos who were in the bar at the time. Seemed like just a nice couple, friendly, seemingly couldn't take their eyes off one another. And so she gained a false sense of security, Virginia, with these two. And so once they left and others eventually left the tavern, she was the one who closed down the place. And when she did that and went out to her car, unbeknownst to her, the Gallegos were waiting in their van. Gerald, inebriated and high, had decided while they waited in the parking lot that they wanted her. He wanted her. And so once Virginia got to her car, she heard a knock on the window, driver's side, and saw it was Gerald. And, he smiled, she smiled. She assumed he, maybe had some car problem or something, and she rolled down her window. Unfortunately, that's when he stuck his .357 Magnum revolver in her face and forced her out of the car. And in her case, being 34, a mother of two, she had to endure being raped there in his van, and the situation was so unsettling for her that she actually wanted to die. She just, it was just a situation where she was just so traumatized by it all. And
Certainly.
Gerald was only too happy to oblige, and he shot her to death. And it was a month later before her body was found in a place called Clarksburg in southeastern Yolo County in a swamp area. So this was another tragedy that happened because of the Gallegos, but once again, they were able to dodge the bullet, so to speak, themselves, but not without there being a close call. After Virginia Moko's death, the authorities were trying to question everyone that had been in the tavern that night, and they were told about this young couple that were there laughing, seemingly having a good time, and they were able to track down Charlene and actually had a detective go to talk to her. And when he did, she told him that calmly that she was there. Her boyfriend, as she called him, was there, and they were just drinking. They had just come back from fishing that night, and they didn't know anything about the bartender or what may have happened. And since she had become seasoned in being charming and conniving, she was able to convince the detective that she did know nothing about Virginia Moko's murder.
Right.
And from that point on, the two of them were in the free and clear once again for the time being.
Now, the 10th and 11th murder, Craig Miller and Mary Elizabeth Sauer, is the end of their reign of horror. And you can tell us how that worked out, that there finally was somebody that alerted police to them, because, of course, I haven't asked this question, but we're already up to 9 murders, and the police have made no connection. They have no suspects, and these people are not even on their radar, are they?
No. That was the sad thing about this. I mean, normally when there's a serial killer, the police are able to connect the dots pretty quickly. They may not know who the killer is, but they have a good feeling that a serial killer is on the loose. But because these two moved around, used different guns and different methods of killing, bludgeoning, strangulation, shooting, they just weren't able to connect the dots up to this point, the authorities. But their final 2 victims, Craig Miller, 21, and Mary Elizabeth Sauer, 21, college sweethearts at California State University, Sacramento.
Yeah.
They were abducted on November the 2nd, 1980. They were at a fraternity dinner dance, Craig being a member of the fraternity, and they were leaving the dinner dance at a strip mall at around the same time that the Gallegos were driving around in their car. This time, they had put aside their van for an Oldsmobile. And so just by pure chance, Gerald just told Charlene, who was driving, pull up into this lot, which was the lot of the strip mall and the restaurant where the fraternity dinner dance was occurring. And so they just drove around the lot, didn't see anyone in particular. And then going around it the second time, that's when they happened to spot Craig Miller and Mary Sauer walking toward their car. And so Gerald had become pretty reckless at this point, and his use of the drugs and alcohol in combination had picked up. So, and he had a sense of invincibility, I believe, after having successfully murdered 9 people and never having to face the police himself even once. So he had this sense of invincibility there, and so he got out of the car this time himself to meet them, Craig Miller and Mary Sowers, at their car, and pulled out his gun, .25 caliber, and told them they're coming with him. And he tried to make it seem like it would just be some sort of robbery or something, but he still wanted them to go with him, which,
right,
was a red flag right there.
Sure.
So, but the gun, as had been the case with every single victim up to this point, these 2 victims, they saw the gun pointed at them, and the thought was death right here if we don't comply. So we have to go with him, and then, hopefully they'll let us go down the line. So they got into the Oldsmobile, and a fraternity brother of Craig Miller's also happened to have just come into the light at this time and saw his friends getting into this vehicle that wasn't their own. So he walked up to the vehicle with Charlene, before Charlene could get back into the car, because she had gotten out too, but she was this time the silent partner as far as luring the victims. This time it was just blunt, gun pointed at them, get into the car or else. But once this fraternity brother walked up to the car to ask, what's going on here, it was Charlene who told him to get the heck out of there, mind your own business, and actually slapped him.
Yeah, that was crazy.
So this big, fraternity brother, he was, taken aback by that, but he still looked into the car, at his friends, and Craig told him also that, he should leave, not wanting him to end up being a victim if they were going to be. So
right,
Charlene got into the car and stormed off, but the fraternity brother, quick to the whip, he got the license plate number there and wrote it down.
Right.
And then notified the authorities. And that was the beginning of the end for the Gallegos, although eventually this license plate identification number came into question because the authorities eventually used hypnosis to get this information from him, and it was challenged in the courts. And eventually they were unable, the authorities, to use that part of what he saw in the prosecution of Gerald Gallego. But in any event, at that point, the authorities finally had something to go on because they knew that this couple was missing and that this 2 people that this fraternity brother was able to describe pretty well, a young couple, were the ones that were looking for, that they believed were responsible for this abduction. So they actually were able to use the license plate number to trace the car to Charlene.
Sorry.
Okay, I was able to chase this license plate to Charlene, and they were sent to talk to her, a detective, and she was home when he came, and she said that she had, again, drawing on her charms that had been fine-tuned through all this. She said that she and her boyfriend, once again, used that in identifying him. We're just driving around. They'd had too much to drink. They don't know anything about any college couple. You know, you have the wrong people, the wrong car. So the detective didn't have anything to hold her on. The car wasn't even there at that point. So he told her that he'd come back later to talk to her. Once he left, she called Gerald, and the two of them were on the run then. I mean, he, I think, realized at that point that they were on to them, and the best thing they could do was get out of Dodge, so to speak.
Right.
The authorities were able to find Craig Miller's body where it had been dumped, shot multiple times in the head, and for Mary Beth Sowers, which this is backtracking just a little bit before the authorities went to talk to Charlene, but Gerald and Charlene took Mary Sowers to their apartment that they were staying at the time, and where Gerald repeatedly raped her after she had witnessed her boyfriend being executed by Gerald, but she still was somehow hoping to get out of this alive, so she did whatever Gerald asked of her, which first was to go to this apartment without making a fuss to attract any attention. Once he had finished with his sexual assault, while Charlene just sat in another room doing nothing but allowing it to happen, then he took her out into a rural area and shot her to death.
Yeah.
Well, it was at that point that they then came back to Charlene's place. Gerald dropped her off. He went elsewhere, and that's when the police detective showed up to talk to her. So once they got wind of these two victims being dead and some other circumstantial evidence connecting that car to them, the Gallegos, they were on the run, left the state.
Now, where were they apprehended, and what were the circumstances?
Well, they were apprehended in Omaha November the 18th, November 17th, 1980. They were captured by the FBI while attempting to pick up money that had been wired to them by Charlene's parents at a Western Union office.
Right.
So Gerald had said that he would never be taken alive if it ever came down to that, but when it did come down to it, he gave up without doing anything but putting his hands up. I mean, they were there with firepower, the FBI, and if he'd given them any excuse, they would have taken him out, but he was afraid to die when all was said and done, in spite of what he'd done to 11 others.
Right.
And Charlene was captured inside the Western Union office. Gerald had waited outside as the lookout, and she gave up without, I think, more out of relief perhaps than anything.
Right. What I found interesting, too, is just going back a little bit, and this is jumping ahead, but to show the psychopathic nature of Charlene, and that's what I will call her, as a psychopathic killer, in that she was so calm, and despite all the stress from police, twice when things could have went the other way, she could have cracked. Normal people would have cracked. She was very cool, calm, and collect. But also when the last victim was taken to the home, the apartment, she waited for hours, and her comment later was basically how messy the sheets were going to be after Gerald was finished his ordeal of rape for hours and hours, because he had such an insatiable need. And so her priorities were completely different than you and I, and there's no logic to it. And I just wanted to point out that was another eerie part of your book where you get that information.
Yes.
Now both of these are arrested, and We're going to go a little bit longer into the hour if you've got a couple minutes, because we won't go into the entire story. We've got to have something for the readers to hang on to. But tell us just initially what police did in terms of trying to get information from Gerald and from Charlene. What did they threaten Charlene with? What did they say to Gerald? Tell us how the police proceeded once they had them in custody.
Okay, well, they were, as is often the case when there are two perpetrators, they tried to pit them against one another to see if one could crack under the weight of what the other one may have said.
Sure.
In Gerald's case, he tried to portray this as something that the two of them had done equally, and even suggested that Charlene had been the trigger person on more than one occasion. Charlene tried to portray herself as a victim of sorts, living with him under fear, and she was just strictly the setup person, but didn't do anything else, as if that excused her atrocious behavior.
Right.
So the authorities at that point were still only looking at two murders that they were aware of. Craig Miller shot with a .25 caliber pistol. They were just intent on getting him for these murders, but Charlene had an ace in the hole that they weren't aware of. She was able to tell them about some other killings, quite a few others that she and Gerald had participated in.
Sure.
And she would be willing to tell them a lot more if they would cut her a deal. And so the authorities from several counties and several states decided that once she began to spill the beans on these other killings that were open cases in several jurisdictions,
right,
they were very interested in this. And so in order to get closure for the various families of these victims, they decided they would offer Charlene a deal of 16 years and 8 months in prison in total if she turned state's evidence against Gerald, so that he would be the one that they go after with everything they had.
Right.
And so she agreed to that, testified against him in court. Gerald acted as his own attorney in his first trial. He was tried in California first and then Nevada. And so they were literally pitted against one another in court as he attempted to break her, and she attempted to stand by her statements regarding what happened. He was convicted of murdering Craig Miller and Mary Beth Sowers, and other murders were linked through court to him, even though they weren't specifically named as that he was going to on trial for. 2 of those he did go on trial for in Nevada. So he was given a death sentence in California, and 2 years later, 1984, he was given a death sentence in Nevada for 2 murders.
And he's still alive to this day?
No. Actually, he died in the early 2000s of rectal cancer in prison, and he had spent years in the courts, appeal after appeal. He sort of used the California and Nevada to his advantage, because he could appeal one state and then appeal the other, and so he was able to do this to stay alive all these years until cancer caught up with him.
Right.
Meanwhile, in 1997, Charlene was released, having served her 16 years and 8 months, and she was told that she would have to register as a felon wherever she lived, but other than that, she was free to do whatever she wanted. So this has been one of the things that people have told me angrily, that they just can't understand how Charlene Gallego, a direct participant in 11 murders, could get off such a light sentence.
Sure.
And, I can't argue that with them, because it's hard to imagine today for sure that any person that was involved in 11 murders could get off with a relatively light sentence.
Yes.
Like that. And so the authorities have defended this, the DA's office, by saying that they still felt that it was best to go after him as the main person, the trigger man, the one who did all the brutalities, but the lure is just as bad as the person that actually does these horrible things. I mean, she made it possible for just about every instance, all of the instances, in fact, even the last two. She was there driving around doing whatever he wanted, Gerald, until they found those victims. So I think a life in prison without the possibility of parole would have been a good deal for her versus death sentence.
But that being said, unless I'm wrong here, the authorities would have never known about those other murders, or it would have been unlikely they would have made maybe a link in all those other murders. So she did do a service in terms of families looking for some, again, and that's not closure, but some bit of closure in terms of knowing about the whereabouts of their missing loved ones.
Well, her good deed, if you will, was strictly for self-preservation.
Well, sure.
So she's
no saint, that's for sure.
Family members might have preferred if they could do it over again, if they knew that she would get such a relatively light sentence. They might rather to have seen her follow the same path as Gerald, end up on death row. In fact, just after Charlene got out of prison, she appeared on a talk show in which she more or less defended her actions as being forced upon her as another victim of Gerald Gallego. So she tried to use the abuse excuse that she was frightened of him and just felt she had to do what she did so she wouldn't get killed. But family members of victims rejected that outright, not too surprisingly.
Sure, certainly.
On that show. And so I think that perhaps if the authorities could do it over again, they would have made that sentence stiffer, because they really held the cards more than she did then. Once they became apprised of these other victims, they could have still put the heat on her and got her to give up information while still giving her a stiff sentence.
Well, yes, I think most people, when they read the book, when they even hear about the case, if they looked at the trial, it would not a big stretch for them to believe that she was a willing participant, a psychopathic killer, and just as guilty as Gerald for agreeing to everything in the first place. And of course, everything was just for her survival. The only good thing is that we do have, again, we just know about some murders that police might not have put together, and certainly Gerald wasn't talking.
Yes, there were two very good crime documentaries based on the sex slave murders. One, the biography channels, Crime Stories, did one called the Love Slave Murders, and then on Investigation Discovery's Wicked Attraction series, Twisted Twosome episode based on the book. So those are still, they've been out for a couple of years now, but they show the reruns quite a bit on TV, and you could actually get these DVDs online, and as well as the trailer for them.
So you recommend both of these?
Yes, I do actually, because I thought they both had their perspectives were slightly different in how they presented the cases, but I thought that they did a good job in giving the viewers a glimpse of the dark side of life, just how two of the most brutal killers as a couple in history, I believe, how they got started and how they went through these killings and their trial and aftermath. I thought that they did a good job in depicting the things that I had in the book. So
well, that's good. Yeah, usually don't get authors singing the praises of television versions of their story. So that's good to see. Good to see some accuracy there, anyway, and respect for what they have done. Now, we just got a couple minutes, Barry, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about. You must have a website, but I also wanted to know that you are the author of about 40 published books. Some nonfiction, crime thrillers, but tell us how many true crime books you have, and maybe just tell us a little bit about your background. And I was also interested in your interest in ripperology.
Okay. Well, I have a bachelor's and master's degree in criminal justice from Michigan State University. That's how I got going into this world of criminology. And I have several true crime books and many criminology books under my belt. I have a new true crime anthology coming up next summer called Masters of True Crime, Chilling Stories of Murder and the Macabre. I'm the editor and got quite a few of the best-selling true crime writers out there, Catherine Ramsden, Harold Schechner, Michelle McPhee, Amanda Lamb, and many more. So that's one thing I'm working on in the true crime area. So that'll be out in the summer of 2012.
And what is that? Is that going to be short stories or?
That's going to be short stories. Yes, short true crime stories. Of,
new short stories or?
Yes, Brent. Yes, original.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Sounds like a great idea. I'm really looking forward to that too.
Yes, I would be happy to come back on and next summer talk about it.
Absolutely.
Maybe I can get my contributors as well to come on.
No, it sounds great. I mean, I know the lineup. I've had quite a few of them on my program already, including yourself now. So I'm going to really looking forward to that. That's going to be, I see such a shift now from it used to be fictional short stories, horror stories now to, because nonfiction, nothing can top. Like your story here, this is incredible. This is a story that I was not aware of, yet it's in such a fantastic, incredibly horrific story with incredible amount of victims and these incredible personalities. So it's just, who needs fiction when you've got nonfiction at the level that we have? So many incredibly horrifying true stories.
Yes, that's certainly a scary tale, and it's just a reflection of this violent society we live in, where people that may appear on the outside to be normal, law-abiding citizens can be brutal killers, like Gerald and Charlene Gallego. The sex slave murders can be found in bookstores at Amazon.com for people who read ebooks. It's in Kindle, Nook, Google eBooks. You can find it at bookstores, local bookstores as well. If they're out of it, they'll order it for you just by asking.
Right on. And I saw that you're doing it's really popular on Kindle right now. Number 5, Serial Killer, a bunch of other.
In fact, number 1 right now in Amazon for books on offenders.
Wow.
Number 2 in criminology books. So it's really taken off in Amazon and doing well in Barnes & Noble as well, Nook books. So in Barnes & Noble. And
so it's a younger audience, I think, and a new audience is getting turned on to this book again. So I think that's really good, and congratulations that you're having so much success as an ebook as well. I think the cover is just incredible too. By the way, I think it just captures the eeriness of the entire story. Without a lot of covers I note that could be better, and I really was impressed with the cover of your book. I thought it was amazing. It really catches your eye. So.
Oh, good. That's I think the cover, it says a lot about a story, and if you can capture the interest of a reader by the cover, then that's half the battle, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. These days, for sure, certainly. And just for a note, we didn't talk about you. Are you a Ripperologist, and what is your interest in Jack the Ripper?
Well, Jack the Ripper is perhaps the standard by which serial killers have been measured ever since 1888, when he did his thing, killing prostitutes in London, in the Whitechapel area. So the fact that Jack the Ripper was never identified, and yet everyone knows who Jack the Ripper is, it's always been fascinating to me, because in being a criminologist and writing about serial killers, he's like the one that really put serial killers on the map, so to speak. In fact, since the Ripper, that's really when these nicknames that have been attached to killers, serial killers, began. So, all the things that we've heard about since then, the killers that have been named, such as the Boston Strangler, Yorkshire Ripper, Beltway Sniper, etc., that's all really began during the Jack the Ripper days. But my fascination also had to do with the prostitute angle for him. I've written a number of books on prostitutes. My latest one, Prostitution in the Digital Age, that just came out last month. But long before the digital age, prostitutes were still plying their trade. And the fact that in Victorian England you had this serial killer that was taking them out, mutilating them in ghastly ways, and somehow evading the authorities, not even sure if the killer was a male or female. It just really was something that caught my attention naturally, and was just something that I felt was a killer that set the stage for other killers in terms of their brutalities, and other killers that have chosen prostitutes as their victims, such as the Green River Killer. And then the fact that with Jack the Ripper, there were so many possibilities for victims, for the perpetrator.
Sure.
Primarily, they were looking at people like slaughterers or butchers or surgeons or physicians due to the manner in which the women were mutilated. And then some experts felt that the Ripper was an educated, upper-class person, such as an aristocrat, who may have taken out his frustrations on lower-class women. And then there's even been some who have speculated that the killer may have been a midwife who had a hatred for prostitutes and could easily have moved around Whitechapel without being a suspect. So I think that the fact that Jack the Ripper allows such a stretch of the imagination, because here's a killer that is perhaps the most infamous killer in history, certainly as a serial killer, and yet we really have no idea who the culprit, the true culprit, was. But it leaves a lot to the imagination, and it gives criminologists like myself the opportunity to study that crime in relation to that criminality that he was involved in relation to today's serial killers and killers of prostitutes in specific. I've written a book, a novel, that's half fiction and half fact, called The Dark Streets of Whitechapel, that's also out in Kindle and Nook and Google eBooks. This novel is one in which I use much of what I know about the real Jack the Ripper, only I have my killer be an American Jack the Ripper who flees America to go to London after he had been captured by authorities in the United States in New York City. And so in London, he goes on to follow the exact path that is a historical document of the various people that Jack the Ripper killed in real life. Mary Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. And so I sort of had fun with that,
Sure.
to...
So you do the prequel. You do the prequel to Jack the Ripper.
Yes.
Yes, interesting. Wow.
So
yeah. I think Jack the Ripper is fascinating as well as the how early on, how many years ago he almost created true crime in the media with the newspapers, created a frenzy, but also his contact with authorities and the organ removal, where even today there have been some crimes I was involved with. Follow the case where someone did a particularly Ripper-esque type murder, but still the horrifying nature of what he did, the contact, taunting authorities, the mutilation and display of the victims, and then the escalation. He really was set the standard for serial killers. I mean, he really was an overachiever, that's for sure.
Yes, this taunting of police with these letters, Dear Boss, Saucy Jackie postcards, and From Hell letters.
Yeah.
That there were hundreds of letters that were being sent to the authorities and newspapers at the time, but most of them went nowhere as far as having any credibility. But these 3 letters in particular, with the similarities in the handwriting and the knowledge that the person seemed to have, convinced the authorities that they might, actually have their man behind these letters. But they weren't able to, unfortunately, find the suspect or find someone that they could definitively point toward as Jack the Ripper.
Yes, that's for sure. Well, we're going to have to wrap up now. We could go on forever. I mean, it has been very, very enjoyable talking to you, Barry. For our audience, you've been listening to R.Barri Flowers with his incredible book, now available in ebook and Nook and Google Books, The Sex Slave Murders.
Yes, and it's also in print as well. You can get it in Amazon.com. It's in print again.
Yes, I see that. It's amazing. A reissue of an incredible story. It's definitely warranted. The Sex Slave Murders by R.Barri Flowers. Thank you very much for showing up and appearing on our little program here, Barry. Thank you very much, and I hope to talk to you again real soon.
Come back again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. As soon as you want to be coming back on, just let me know. Maybe we'll have you even on before next summer with the new anthology of short story, true crime stories with all the biggest names in true crime. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm sure our audience will too. Thank you very much, Barry, for this interview, and have yourself a good evening.
Okay, same to you, Dan. Take care.
Thank you. You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, with your host, Dan Zupansky, and we've been discussing the Sex Slave Murders by R.Barri Flowers. Look him up and see the other amazing books that this author has. Have yourself a good evening. Good night.